Hi class, this is Lisa Boss and I am making this short video for you because I want to just give you some tips on how to write your introduction and background, which is the next section that you will submit for N6105. So as you can see, I have my systematic review pulled up on the screen, the one that is about loneliness, cognitive function in the older adult. So I'm just going to use this one as an example to kind of explain to you what I did, and then you can apply that to your variables. So first of all, the one thing to remember here is that I have three variables: loneliness, cognitive function, older adult. And so in the process of the introduction and background, I have to explain and defend why we care about these three things. So, that's something I said in class, is that we always have to answer the who cares question, or why do we care question. So this is going to be the most important part of your paper, to answer that question. So you are going to be submitting an introduction and a background separately. The way I have it is just one long introduction and background together. And so that's just because this journal wanted it that way, but we can break it down to an introduction and a background, and I'll show you how it's broken down here so that you can do it as well. So basically the introduction is just to introduce people to your concepts and why we care. And then the background is going to go much deeper into why we care and the importance and relevance of it. So I start out here in my introduction with loneliness. So that to me was the thing that I needed to start out talking about: one, what it is, and then talk about how it's correlated to cognitive decline, since that's my other factor. So this first paragraph, I start talking about loneliness and what exactly it is, and how I'm going to approach it in terms of what it means to me in this paper. And then I go on in the second paragraph to talk about how loneliness is associated with cognitive decline. So then that establishes why we care. Because if we don't care about loneliness, if it's just this sad thing, we care about that as people, but in terms of science, there needs to be some sort of correlation or relationship with your health outcome. So in this case, I'm correlating loneliness with cognitive decline. So then I talk about just a few references, just skimming the surface on that relationship. And then I explain, so cognitive decline then ultimately can lead to dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So obviously that's a huge topic in our society right now. So that establishes that. And then also it establishes that with the older adult. So I would say that really, in terms of the way your paper is, then these first two paragraphs would be the introduction. And so then I start with the third, the third paragraph then would be the background. So that's where I'm going to dive much deeper and talk about everything in much more detail. So this third paragraph. So I've already established there's a relationship between loneliness, cognitive function, cognitive decline, and the elderly. So then I talk about what are the potential mechanisms underlying that association between loneliness and cognitive function. And so I'm starting out saying that relationship and the underlying mechanisms are poorly understood. But we do have some evidence that suggests it could be the HPA axis and inflammation and prolonged activation of the HPA axis. And then how that's related to certain psychosocial conditions that are associated with social lifestyles and aging. So then I bring in this other piece about how lonely elderly people report experiencing chronic stress, more likely to experience negative thoughts, which can worsen their sense of loneliness. So again, I'm tying it all together, but at a much deeper, detailed level than I did in the first two paragraphs. Then I talk again, I go on to talk about how loneliness has been correlated with cortisol levels in college students. And it's okay that that's a different population because there just hasn't been much work on it. So, and that also builds my case on why we need to do it in the elderly, because it's been done in college students, middle-aged, and some older adults, but it hasn't been done to exhaustion. So it makes the case that it needs to be done more. I'm still talking about here the HPA axis and the implications of the prolonged hypercortisolism and how that relates to the anabolic catabolic hormonal balance, and how that can have detrimental negative cellular changes in the brain. And then I'm going on to talk more about inflammation and how inflammation and loneliness are correlated. And I'm still going on and on about this science and this underlying reason, because that justifies why we care in this case. So that has to be very detailed and very specific. And so that's why I spent so much time on it. And so then this last paragraph is kind of the conclusion of the background, just to wrap it up. So I'm talking about loneliness has been associated with cognitive decline, but most of the literature focuses on the association between social networks and cognitive function. So I'm making the case here that, there has been some work with loneliness, but most of it's been in social network, which is similar but not the same. So then I talk about that a little bit. Here, I had told y'all that if there had been a previous systematic review recently, that you can't really do it again. So I did find one here that was similar, but not the same. So I pointed that out, that a previous review was focused only on the nature of loneliness within contextual frameworks and general clinical health significance of loneliness across the lifespan. And that was done in 2006. And so then I made the point that mine is different from that previous focus. And the purpose of this systematic review is to synthesize current findings on the correlations of loneliness and cognitive function in older adults greater than or equal to 60 years old. So another thing that I want to point out that y'all might have noticed in your modules on Canvas is that you should refer to this as a study. And so that's actually incorrect, because the systematic review is not a research study. So you should refer to it just like I have right here. The purpose of this systematic review was to blah, 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 not to say the purpose of the study. So I just want to be clear in that distinction that this is not a research study. It's a systematic review that synthesizes findings from studies that have been published. And then I have, just to look at this other one of mine, this is another study that another systematic review that I did, endogenous sex hormones and cognitive function in older adults. And so it follows a similar format as the other one, although it's much longer. I think this is 40 pages. But so I started out here with the abstract, and then I'm starting out here talking about how the most rapidly growing subset of Americans is the aging population. And so we talk about that and cognitive decline. So that makes the case that this is a huge problem with all of these growing number of individuals that are elderly that have cognitive decline, and we need to figure out what's behind all of it. So I did go in and talk a little bit about cognitive decline and how that's not a normal consequence of aging and what that is exactly. And then I take it from this angle. Recent evidence indicates that sex hormones, particularly estrogen and testosterone, can influence cognitive function. And so I talk about that relationship and the science behind it and the evidence that supported it. So then here, the purpose is in a separate paragraph, but it says, given the significant potential role of sex hormones in cognitive function, the purpose of this systematic review is to summarize the current findings on the associations between endogenous estrogen, testosterone, and cognitive function in older adults greater than or equal to 60 years old. So then I believe I emailed you both of these so you can look at these for a reference. Okay, so I think that's all I have for you to have some quick tips on the background and the introduction. So overall, focus on your variables that you chose, and I think most of you chose 3, and how to correlate them and tie them together and make a relevant case for why this needs to be published, why anybody would care to read about this. The introduction needs to be superficial and dramatic more than the background, so that you can quickly establish this is a major problem, this is why it's a problem, and then with the background go into more detail on what you think you need to based on what your variables are. So that's it. I hope this helps, and I will talk to you later. Bye.